Good morning, everyone. Again, this is Mayan Johnson from SCAG Los Angeles office. Welcome, everyone, to the Rhena 101 webinar. This is the time and place to ask questions that you've always been afraid to ask about Rhena in public. Just so you are aware of how we're going to go about for the next hour, we'll be giving a 20-minute presentation on Rhena 101. Afterwards, we'll have a about 40-minute Q&A session. So just things to keep in mind that since this is mostly web text, so if you do have a comment and you're going through the webinar, please text your comments to the user Jasmine Estores. Just double click on her name in the Zoom application that you're using, and we'll be able to go through the questions that way. And we won't be able to answer all of your questions today due to time limitations, but we'll compile all of our questions into a frequently asked questions sheet, along with posting of this webinar on our website. For those in our video conference offices, thank you for also participating that way. What we'll do is at the beginning of the Q&A, I'll go ahead and ask if the video conference offices have any questions, and then we'll come back to you towards the end as well. So we won't forget you if you have any questions. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our Executive Director, Kome Ejise, who'd like to make a few remarks.
Good morning. Thanks, Mayan. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My understanding is we have in excess of 80 connections on board right now, which is a really good turnout. And we want to make sure this is as informative as possible. Now, most of you are probably familiar with Rhena, but if you're not, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment is a state law that allows or requires us as an MPO, as a COG, to plan with our cities and counties for what our housing needs are going to be for the next 8 years. And so we go through this process, and Mayan will walk you through the process that we sort of follow predetermined by state law. And hopefully you have a better understanding of it. And if you have any questions, we can probably provide some clarification. It's a little bit of a complicated technical process. And what we're trying to do is to make it as legible as possible for all of you to understand and appreciate what each person's or each agency's role is. But first, why do we need to do this? I think the reason for Rhena hopefully helps to highlight why we take it seriously, and I'll talk a little bit later on about what we need to do beyond just looking at the Rhena numbers. From this first graphic, it shows that we've fallen behind very dramatically in housing production in our region, needless to say across the state, but more so in our region, which is what we have charge over. In the 70s, in the decade between the 70s and the 80s, we were steadily producing enough housing to house people that move into or are born or households that are created in that period of time. So for every person, we were able to, for every almost 2 people, we were able to provide a housing unit, which was a good rate to meet our housing needs. We've fallen behind now where we are producing 1 unit as of the last decade. 1 unit per more than 3 people. And so it's creating a number of things. One is overcrowding. The housing shortage also creates housing affordability issues. And we've seen those reflect itself in so many different problems that we're dealing with today, the least of which is not just serious crisis in terms of lack of housing. As population continues to increase, if we don't do something to arrest it, it only gets worse. And that's really the trend that we're trying to hopefully, through the Rhena process, overcome. Now, in law, the Rhena itself has some key objectives. I think there are 5 key objectives that we need to focus on. The intent is not just to come up with a number for number's sake. The intent is really ultimately to increase housing supply, and not just housing supply, but make sure the housing supply is also in a mix that meets the needs of our various communities, different kinds of housing types, and also to make sure that they're affordable and meets the needs of our various communities. Our housing needs also don't have to be in contest with the environment. I think the intent of the law is expressly stated that it needs to also be equitable and meet sustainability goals. In other words, we don't want to gobble up all of our vacant land, ag resources or environmentally sensitive land, or in fact, move into areas that are very precarious in terms of wildlands and urban interface where we have wildfires and things like that. And so we need to be sure that as we fulfill the need of housing going forward, we have to also meet this sustainability requirements. Likewise, we have to focus on making sure that we have jobs housing balance. We're going through our regional planning process right now, and one of the things that we're looking at is how do we make sure that we continue to grow jobs in centers that already have housing as we grow housing in areas that have jobs. And so that's with intent that we have regional housing, jobs housing balance, and that has implications for not just providing housing mix, but also has implications for the long commutes that we see in our region that could reduce greenhouse gases, greenhouse gas emissions. One of the other requirements that I think is important is to make sure that while we're on task to provide housing, that we not only provide housing across all income categories, but we also do not burden any one community with more of a certain income level housing. So we want to make sure that jurisdictions, our cities and counties, are also not disproportionately burdening different parts of the community with a particular type of income level housing. And finally, this is a requirement that's an objective that's new, is to affirmatively further fair housing. These are things that we need to do that are progressive in making sure that there is fair housing, there's no discrimination under any circumstance. But again, it speaks to the issue of equity and meeting our housing needs without causing other societal issues. Now, I just want to speak real quickly before I hand it over to Mayan about what we need to continue to focus on. The RHNA cycle, the RHNA process, this is the 6th cycle of RHNA. And this cycle we think is just about as important as any other one, maybe even more so, because we're so far behind. The intent of this cycle is to be able to help our jurisdictions understand what capacity they need to provide for over the next 8 years. And that's just the essence of RHNA, is to come up with the numbers and the zoning that we need to have for the next 8 years. But beyond that, our cities also have constraints in meeting these obligations. Not just enough for us, at least the way we're thinking about it at SCAG. It's not just enough for us to throw numbers at our cities and say, go build this number of housing. We feel an obligation to also help our jurisdictions in finding ways to meet that objective, because ultimately RHNA is not just about the number. RHNA is about producing housing. And so we have this, for lack of a more imaginative phrasing, we call it beyond RHNA approach that we're taking to things, that after we're done with RHNA, in fact, as we work through RHNA, we're beginning to build the capacity to also help our communities in being able to meet, if not all of the obligation, a substantial level of the obligation that RHNA requires them to meet. And so we feel very strongly about this, because for us, using the word existential can be cheapened very quickly on any topic. But we think it's really an existential issue for our region, that we're not producing enough housing. What that translates to in very simple terms is, if we don't produce enough housing, more so enough workforce or affordable housing, we will continue to bleed talent from our region. We've seen in surveys that housing is one of the significant issues why people are moving out, but more so the younger people, the more younger talent that can't afford to come out of school and situate themselves here. The ones that have been able to stay around are living further away and commuting in long distances, causing difficulties in our communities in terms of greenhouse gases, but also just the family situation. So these are the existential issues that we feel like is compelling for us to look beyond just RHNA, to talk about how we actually meet our housing obligations and produce housing at all income levels, and more so at workforce level and affordable levels, so that people can live in our communities and thrive, and allow our economy to continue to be vital, the vitality in our communities to continue to be there, and also allow for our region to continue to maintain its status as the most economically vital region in the country. And so with that, I just want to thank you all again for joining us, and hopefully we'll get a lot of good questions that we can react to on this webinar today. If not, we'll catch up with you with written responses to all your questions and post those on the web. And so I'm going to introduce our lead planner on housing, Marianne Johnson. Marianne.
Thank you, Kome. For those just joining us, I'm Mayan Johnson, Housing and Land Use Planner here at SCAG. Because this is a RHNA 101 webinar, and it's only for 1 hour, we may not have time to get to all of your questions today. But if you can text your questions through the web app that you're using, Zoom, just text them directly to the user Jasmine, and then we'll be able to get to your questions during Q&A. Or after this presentation webinar today, we'll be posting frequently asked questions, so a compilation of questions through today's webinar, and we'll be able to post that online along with the video of today's webinar. And for those in the video conferencing offices, we'll also be able to get to your verbal Q&A. We'll get to that at the beginning of the Q&A process, and then also before we sign off. So with that, I'll go into the rest of the presentation about RHNA 101. So for those who are very new to the process, the RHNA Regional Housing Needs Assessment, it's a state law housing requirement to determine regional housing needs. It's an 8-year planning period. So for the 5th cycle, that's a current cycle which your jurisdiction's housing element covers. It's October 2013 to October 2021, and this was adopted by SCAG in October 2012. Different council of governments throughout the state are on different cycles, so this one is just unique to the SCAG region. The 6th cycle, which is what we're currently developing, covers October 2021 through October 2029. The final allocation adoption for the 6th cycle is October 2020. So the RHNA process, this is the general flow of the process. Right now, we're at the regional determination process. This HCD, that's the California Department of Housing and Community Development, they give us a regional RHNA allocation. So this covers 4 income categories. You have very low, which is 50% or less of county median income, low, which is 50 to 80%, moderate, which is 80 to 120%, and above moderate, which is 120% and above of county median income. So this regional determination, that's for, of course, the region, but we assign a draft RHNA allocation through adopting a methodology. But the regional determination that HCD gives us at the beginning of the process has to be the same RHNA allocation at the end of the process. So whatever they give us at the beginning, we have to meet at the end. So that's the regional determination process. They do that in consultation with each council of government. So we prepare a data package with information such as growth forecasts, overcrowding statistics, vacancy rates, and we send that up as a package to HCD. But they, at the end of the day, make the final determination for the region. So we anticipate this by mid-August. So once we have that number, we'll be developing a methodology. The methodology is applied to the determination to get each individual draft RHNA allocation for every jurisdiction in the SCAG region. So that's 191 cities and the 6 unincorporated county areas. So I'll go into in a few slides the methodology process, but also there's a large public participation process in which we can receive comments for it during that time. So once we have the draft RHNA allocation, we anticipate we'll have that either in February or March of next year. We'll have an appeals process. So jurisdictions can appeal their number, and we'll have public hearings associated with that in the summer of next year. And then the final RHNA allocation is anticipated for adoption October of next year. Jurisdictions will have 1 year after that to adopt their housing elements, so they have to update it for the 6th cycle and submit that to HCD. Housing elements for the 6th cycle are due in October 2021. So a lot of you have probably participated in the fifth cycle as well, but recent housing legislation, there's over several hundred over the past couple of years proposed, and a lot of them dealt with not just housing, but specifically on RHNA. So there are some changes between the last cycle and what we currently have to do for the sixth cycle. I'll go through a couple of them in the next few slides. One of them is the number of objectives. The fifth cycle had 4 of them, whereas the sixth cycle has 5. It's the addition of affirmatively furthering fair housing. So there's some requirements associated with that. Our methodology has to meet all of the objectives or further the objectives of state housing law. And then there's some surveys associated with that as well, which we conducted earlier this year. There's also factors for the regional determination process. That's where HCD gives us that regional determination number, and they do this in consultation with our data packet from each COG. So for the fifth cycle, you covered things such as jobs housing fit, replacement need, and other factors. The sixth cycle, we specifically had to add overcrowding, cost burden, and also a minimum vacancy need for renter households as part of this data package. For the methodology review, for the fifth cycle and prior cycles, SCAG came up with its own methodology. We had our public process, and then we adopted that. For the sixth cycle, HCD now has a 60-day comment period built into this. So after we develop a draft RHNA methodology after the public process, we have to submit this to HCD for their 60-day review. They'll submit comments back to us, and then we can adopt our final RHNA methodology. So for the sixth cycle, there will be more HCD involvement. Other differences also include a basis for appeals. The fifth cycle and prior cycles indicated that voter referendums or moratoriums that limit the number of residential permits can't be used as a basis to appeal your draft RHNA. For the sixth cycle, this was still included, but now state law specifically excludes using a disallowance or it disallows the use of underproduction as a reason for appeals or stable population growth. That can't be used as a basis for appeal either. It's spelled out in state housing law as well. During the appeals process, there used to be actually 2 separate processes in which you could contest your draft allocation. This time it's been streamlined into 1 appeals process. And again, this will take place next summer. For appeals as well, before it was only a jurisdiction that could appeal its draft RHNA, but now any jurisdiction can appeal another jurisdiction's RHNA allocation, and HCD can also appeal a draft RHNA allocation. So it's more involvement with other jurisdictions in HCD. And finally, another major difference between the last cycle and the one we're developing now is trade and transfer. In prior cycles, if a jurisdiction did not like the RHNA allocation, they could theoretically trade and transfer. They could trade RHNA units to other jurisdictions, but this was specifically taken out for the 6th RHNA cycle. So this option is no longer available. So the regional determination process, as I mentioned in a couple slides earlier, HCD provides that regional determination for the SCAG region. So they also do this in consultation with SCAG and also the California Department of Finance, DOF. So in comparison, the 4th RHNA cycle, which was 2006 to 2014, had about 699,000 units for the entire region. The 5th cycle regional determination, covering 2013 to 2021 planning period, was about 412,000. The 6th cycle, we're still waiting for HCD to give us our determination. We did send up a data packet last month, and so this number is to be determined, but it is likely going to be higher than the 5th cycle allocation. So for the methodology, and this is what the RHNA subcommittee is developing now. It's applied to the regional determination to get each jurisdiction's draft RHNA allocation. And this is also something that each COG develops on their own. So what we did for the 4th cycle and 5th cycle will be different from what we developed for the 6th cycle, and it's also different from what ABAG or SACOG, other COGs in the state, have done for their RHNA cycles. This also includes a survey of all jurisdictions on local planning factors and fair housing policies throughout the SCAG region. And the methodology, as I'll get into a little later, also includes a public review process. So this is just a brief list of things that you could consider for determining or distributing regional housing need. Because once we get that regional determination from HCD, the next question is, what is the most fair and equitable way to distribute to each jurisdiction? How much housing need will they have as represented by the RHNA allocation? So for the sixth cycle, SCAG staff has presented different factors that could be considered, and we reviewed each of these as part of the RHNA subcommittee over the past few months. But things that were talked about include local input on household growth, high quality transit areas or transit proximity, recent building permit activity, share of the regional population, household income distribution, job centers, and overcrowding, and other factors as well. As a point of reference for the fifth RHNA cycle, the only major factors that determined a jurisdiction's RHNA allocation were local input on household growth, replacement need, vacancy need, and then household income distribution. So it was more limited on how we did RHNA in the past. So for the sixth cycle, we're looking at different factors to determine distribution throughout the region. So the proposed RHNA methodology, SCAG staff developed 3 options which were approved for public release. So this is for the public comment period as a recommendation for the next step, which is the CEHD Community Economic and Human Development Committee, and also our SCAG Regional Council, which is basically our board. So they'll be reviewing it actually this Thursday, August 1st. These 3 options, again, for public review. So they will not be selecting an option for the RHNA methodology, but rather just releasing this so we can begin our public hearing and comment process. So rather than go into each of these options and the technical aspect, because I wanted to keep this webinar a RHNA 101 focus, so just a general overview. But this is just an overview of how different the options proposed are. And if you are interested in looking further into the details for these options, they're also on our RHNA webpage. If you go to the RHNA subcommittee, you can click on that. And then the agenda for the RHNA subcommittee, that's listed, it has a full RHNA methodology there. And you can also look at the CEHD and Regional Council agendas. So we'll be having the proposed RHNA methodology after it's reviewed for public release this Thursday. We'll post the entire proposed methodology, so it'll be all in one place for your review. So again, this is pending regional council action this Thursday, but you can see options 1, 2, and 3 are very different. Just as a brief highlight of each one, option 1 is looking at a jurisdiction share of regional population, share of population within high quality transit areas, building permits issued based on an undersupply ratio. There's also, it also features shares of local input on household growth and replacement need. And there's also a social equity adjustment. And again, these are all, the purpose of these is to ensure that we're furthering the objectives of state housing law. Option 2 is much more simple. It just looks at a region or a jurisdiction share of population in proximity to transit, and then household income distribution, social equity adjustment. And then the third option is looking mostly at local input and also then a social equity adjustment. So as a reminder, if you do have specific questions on these methodology options, feel free to email housing@scag.ca.gov. We'll make sure to get to your questions there, but just for the sake of ensuring that this remains a RHNA 101 outline, you might want to direct your specific questions about these options to that email address so we can get to you directly. So the review process for the proposed RHNA methodology, again, we're recommending for public release on August 1st. We'll be having 4 public hearings in the second half of this August. So we will send out public hearing notices throughout the region to the RHNA mailing list, all of our jurisdictions. And you can submit comments at the public hearings or send them to housing@scag.ca.gov. SCAG staff will review all of the comments submitted before we recommend a draft RHNA methodology before we pick one of the options for distribution. So once we have a draft RHNA methodology, again, this will go through our RHNA subcommittee, CEHD committee, and regional council. We'll submit that to HCD for their review, and they have up to 60 days to provide comments on the methodology. So once we have the methodology, we'll have draft RHNA allocations for every jurisdiction. So after the distribution of the draft RHNA allocation, jurisdictions can file an appeal within 45 days. HCD and other jurisdictions in a departure from prior cycles can appeal any jurisdiction's number. Appeals can't be based on voter-approved measures that restrict residential permits issued, underproduction of units, or stable population growth from the last RHNA cycle. So these are things to keep in mind if you are planning to appeal your RHNA number when you get your draft allocation. There's also an additional 45-day comment review period after the appeals process or the appeals deadline, filing deadline is closed. So there is more time to review appeals submitted by all jurisdictions. So the final RHNA adoption, after appeals are heard, any successful appeals are reallocated back to the region. They also have to be consistent with the Connect SoCal, our Sustainable Community Strategy development pattern for the final RHNA. And the final RHNA allocation adoption is October 2020. So the next steps, this August 1st, this Thursday, the CHD and Regional Council will be reviewing the proposed methodology options for public review. August 29th, August 2019, the second half of that month, we'll be having public hearings on the proposed RHNA methodology, and we'll make sure to send out public hearing notices by the end of this week. The draft RHNA allocation will be available next early winter, so February probably. Summer 2020 will have the RHNA appeals process. Then October 2020 is the adoption of the final RHNA allocation plan. So opportunities for public participation. We are still at the very beginning of the RHNA process. So you have plenty of time between now and October of next year to become involved if you haven't already. So all of our public meetings, our meetings are all available to the public. That includes the RHNA subcommittee, CHD, and regional council. The 4 public hearings that we'll have will be able to receive verbal and written comment at those hearings, but you can also email housing@scag.ca.gov. So your comment is reviewed and included as part of the process. And also our RHNA mailing list, if you're not already on it, also send an email to housing@scag so we can make sure that you get all the notices available that we send out to the public regarding RHNA and other housing related milestones. So if you do want more information, you can visit www.scag.ca.gov/RHNA or send an email to housing@scag. So what we'll do now is transition to the Q&A portion. So we'll go through the different questions that you've submitted by now, and then we will spend the rest of the webinar answering your questions. All right, so going through the questions we've received, thank you everyone for already having questions ready. So will the PowerPoint be shared after the webinar? Yes, we will post the PowerPoint with the webinar as soon as we can get to that after this, after 11 a.m. And then we'll also have frequently asked questions for the questions we didn't get to today. Actually, what we should do is first go to our regional offices because I know there's some participants who went to the video conference sites. If I can have that on the screen so I can see if anyone. All right, let's just go in, let's see, order. SCAG Imperial Office, do you have any questions you'd like to ask at this point? Oh, if you can unmute your microphone as well.
Chicken himself out for.
Yeah.
No, we don't have questions right now.
I'm sorry, SCAG Imperial.
Not as good as I thought. This is the, direct.
Okay, all right. SCAG San Bernardino office, were there any questions out there?
No questions in San Bernardino, thank you.
All right. SCAG Ventura office?
No, thank you.
All right.
No questions.
right, thank you. And then the South Bay office. Did you have any questions out there? No? Okay. All right, so let's get back to the text questions, and for the video conference offices, I will circle back with you towards the end. All right, and as a reminder, please send your questions to the user Jasmine Astores so we can see your questions. All right, what are the repercussions if we don't meet our assigned RHNA numbers? So currently, each jurisdiction in their housing element does have to plan and zone enough sites for their RHNA allocation. This is to accommodate housing need as identified by RHNA. So on the housing element side, there are some repercussions. If you don't adopt a housing element by the deadline, then you do revert to a 4-year housing element, which can get instead of an 8-year housing element. So you'll need to submit a housing element for 2 cycles or 2 4-year periods in a row before you go back to 8 years. On the production side, there aren't any specific there aren't any specific consequences if you don't actually build enough permits as identified by your annual progress report to HCD. But in terms of if someone could do me a favor and mute your microphone so we don't hear some of the background noise, it would be very helpful. Thank you. Right. So on the production side, there are some restrictions, namely under Senate Bill 35, which requires that jurisdictions who do not permit enough units in certain income categories and the project being proposed pays prevailing wage and meets other requirements, the applicant, the developer, could apply for streamlining, in which it would bypass the conditional permitting process, the discretionary permitting process, and rather the permit would be ministerial. Though that's not a requirement if the applicant or the project does not meet those requirements, or if they decide not to utilize that option, then it wouldn't be applied to that project. So those are the only specific consequences of not building or producing enough housing at this point. Although there are legislation proposed once in a while that does tie other types of funding to housing development, but there's none currently in law right now. There was a general question about disparity among RHNA numbers. And again, this has to do with the methodology that is adopted by SCAG once that's applied to RHNA regional determination. So there sometimes is what looks like a discrepancy, but the formula that's eventually adopted, will be applied to each jurisdiction. So if there are variances in data, that is from census information, from American Community Survey data, and other data sources, everything is applied across the board in the same manner. So jurisdictions are not necessarily singled out with exceptions under a formulaic approach. And you may notice for the 5th cycle, there was a vacancy credit added to RHNA allocations based on the number of vacancies for jurisdictions. A lot of jurisdictions, due to the market downturn, had a lot of vacant units, even more than their projected household growth. So in those cases, you actually ended up with jurisdictions receiving almost no RHNA allocation, or 2 units, for example, because their vacancy credit far exceeded their household growth. So in certain instances, there you see a lot of variation in RHNA allocation, but that was unique for the 5th cycle. And for the 6th cycle, there will not be a vacancy credit. Let's see. So there's a question about subscribing to the RHNA mailing list. Please send an email to housing@scag.ca.gov, and we'll make sure to add your name and email to the RHNA mailing list so you'll see all of the notices. All right. Let's see. A general question about RHNA being the best way to look at housing need for the region. So SCAG's obligation is, or our requirements are for state housing law. So when RHNA does change, there's additional requirements. We are required to include those changes to the RHNA process. And we're always looking at ways, since RHNA is a determination of housing need, but it's not necessarily the way to implement housing. So as Kame had mentioned at the very beginning, we are looking at ways to improve how we approach housing at the regional level, since RHNA is just determining how much housing we'll need to begin with. So, a question about the costs of appealing. There are no costs to appeal a RHNA number, either your own or another jurisdiction's. We'll have more information as we get closer to that part of the process, but there will not be any costs associated with appealing. There's also a question about accessory dwelling units, also known as ADUs, and if there's any restrictions in including them in RHNA accounts. So RHNA is a representation of how much housing a jurisdiction needs to accommodate growth, existing and projected need. So accessory dwelling units are actually one way to meet that need, but they're not specifically included in the RHNA allocation as a unit. If there's a household living in that and that's reported as part of projected household growth or existing need, for example, the household would be included, but the ADU itself is not included. There's a question, if there's no longer a vacancy credit in the sixth cycle, is it a valid option for appeal of one's RHNA allocation? So it's not specified in state housing law that you can't base it on that if you have a high number of vacancies for your jurisdiction. So right now, it's not quite in the RHNA methodology if you have, for example, a higher than normal vacancy rate, but that can certainly be a basis for appeal if that applies to your jurisdiction. I can't guarantee whether or not you would be successful at this point, but you can base your appeal on that. There's also a question about availability of public sewers being a factor in the allocation. So there's actually about 13 local planning factors listed in state housing law, and SCAG surveyed all of our jurisdictions on sewer capacity, water capacity, open land, space preserved for agricultural purposes. And so public sewers is listed as a potential factor, but the methodology, the options proposed as they are right now do not address those specifically, since it's up to the jurisdiction to provide those services or how they provide those services. But they are not currently in the RHNA methodology options as they are in the CHD and Regional Council agenda. Another question is, will SCAG be calculating each jurisdiction's housing numbers for options 1 through 3? We're developing a kind of web-based app Excel sheet so that there is currently in the proposed methodology a step-by-step guide to calculate your own jurisdiction's RHNA number. We don't have the regional determination from HCD, so there'd be a lot of variance. For example, if they gave us 500,000 versus 1 million, there'd be a big difference on each jurisdiction's allocation based on options 1, 2, or 3. But we are trying to develop some kind of Excel sheet where you can enter in what could be a regional determination based on anyone's best guess. But then that way, the different factors going into the options, you can get a sense of what your RHNA number could be based on different levels of regional determination. And then we will be publishing this after the Regional Council's anticipated action of releasing these options for public release. There's a question about how is overcrowding accounted for in the methodology. So that is one of the factors we've looked at the regional level. But right now, one of the reasons why the RHNA subcommittee had, that is one of the factors they did look at for whether overcrowding could be an influencing factor. For example, should more need be assigned to areas where there is a high level of overcrowding? So one of the reasons this was not recommended to be included by staff is that there are many different reasons for overcrowding. A jurisdiction, its neighboring jurisdiction could be not issuing enough permits, but then the overcrowding doesn't occur in that city, it occurs in the city next door, even though that city does issue a lot of permits. And so confining overcrowding to a jurisdictional boundary and assigning RHNA need just based on that may not actually be addressing the problem of the housing crisis, rather that it's a symptom and not a cause of the crisis. So overcrowding at the regional level is easier to measure, but assigning need based on overcrowding, we may not be distributing the need in an equitable manner if that's included. Question if the 6th cycle RHNA allocation replaces the number from the 4th and 5th cycles. So it's the general idea is that each housing element update replaces prior cycles. So if you have zoned enough sites in your housing element and you have it certified by HCD as meeting state housing law, your 6th cycle can include different sites that you did use previously, although there are some caveats associated with that. But in general, your updated housing element should replace prior housing elements. Part of the caveats also include if you do have to revert to a 4-year cycle because you did not adopt your housing element in time, you do end up planning for potentially 2 cycles at once. So there are some caveats associated with that. But if you do adopt your housing element in time by the deadlines, it should replace your prior cycles. Question about universities' dormitory or student housing be counted towards RHNA. In some cases it can, and actually we're still talking with HCD discussing the nuances behind it. Since in some cases some student housing may not be appropriate to the general population depending on how these units are designed. For example, a quad unit may not be appropriate for a large family since it's charged as a per bedroom basis, but in some cases, depending on the design, it might be. So we're still actually working with HCD to look at how student housing can be credited towards meeting your RHNA need as a jurisdiction. Right. And then a question about the web-based Excel sheets. Those will be available by the end of this week. We do still have to wait for the regional council action to release those options for public review. Okay, sure. Let's go back to the regional offices. South Bay, we'll start with you. Did you have any questions you'd like to include?
I'd just like a question right now. I didn't understand your ADU answer. I want to really simplify it. Suppose your RHNA number is 2 and you build a house and then it's got an ADU in the back and you live in the front house and you rent out the back. Does that satisfy RHNA?
Theoretically, yes. SCAG doesn't review housing elements, so I wouldn't be able to, if there's a specific case of saying, yes, that ADU would qualify, but under state housing law, the ADU could meet RHNA needs. So in that example, as long as the rents are appropriate for low income, for example, and you're trying to meet low income need, that ADU could qualify. All right, let's Ventura office, any questions out there?
No questions.
San Bernardino?
No questions, thank you.
All right, Imperial office, any questions out there?
No, thank you.
All right, great. No more questions. All right, question about when will the draft RHNA be released? We can actually calculate that as soon as we have the final methodology adopted by our regional council and CEHD. So we'll make sure to be able to release that and distribute that by February of next year. All Right. Another question about if density will be a factor in the RHNA methodology. We did calculate data on density for each jurisdiction in the SCAG region in the proposed methodology packet. Currently, none of the options do use density as a direct factor, but again, based on any public comments received, as SCAG staff will review all comments, including density and other factors, if those are included in the comment letters. All right. Are there any other questions? I think we will be summarizing all the questions that we received and also include them as part of an FAQ once we post everything to our website. All right. So if there aren't any other questions, I guess we reached the end of the questions. So if you want more information about SCAG or do have any other questions, feel free to email housing@scag.ca.gov. And you can also send any questions, comments, or be added to the RHNA mailing list by emailing housing@scag.ca.gov. All right. So with that, I don't see any other questions being sent in. So I wanted to thank everyone for participating in our first RHNA 101 webinar. RHNA is not a simple, easy process. So feel free to ask questions to staff at any time because we want to make sure the public stakeholders and our jurisdictions are engaged to the extent possible. So thank you, everyone, and thank you for participating, and we'll hope to see you at a RHNA meeting or your comments soon. Thank you.